February 1st, 1989, a property manager in Everett, Washington unlocks apartment number 3 to collect rent from a tenant who hasn't answered his knocks. And what he finds on that bed will haunt this community for 36 years. A disabled woman named Mary Ann Daniels, strangled with 3 ligatures wrapped so tightly around her neck that investigators would later describe the scene as one of the most brutal they'd ever witnessed. And here's what makes your blood run cold about this case. The killer was her neighbor. He moved in the exact same day she did, January 9th, 1989, just 3 weeks before he took her life. And when detectives interviewed him that very first day, they had no idea they were looking directly into the eyes of a murderer who would walk free for more than 3 decades. While Mary Ann's family waited for answers that wouldn't come until January 25th, 2025, when a 61-year-old man drinking beer in a Las Vegas restaurant had no clue that undercover detectives were watching his every move, waiting for him to take that final sip so they could collect the bottle and match his DNA to blood found on the murder weapon 36 years earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how genetic genealogy finally caught a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder. But it's also the story of 1989 in the Seattle area, a time when the Emerald City's reputation was being tarnished by violence that seemed to seep into every corner of the Pacific Northwest. And to understand why Mary Ann's case went cold for so long, you need to understand what was happening in this region during those dark days when serial killers prowled the highways and vulnerable women disappeared with terrifying regularity. Because 3 weeks before Mary Ann Daniels was murdered in her transitional housing apartment, on January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair after confessing to 30 murders, including 11 in Washington state. And while the nation breathed a sigh of relief that this monster was finally gone, another predator was still actively hunting in the Seattle area. Gary Ridgway, who would later become known as the Green River Killer, was in the midst of a killing spree that would ultimately claim at least 49 confirmed victims, though he confessed to murdering as many as 80 women throughout the 1980s and 90s, most of them sex workers and runaways who vanished from the strip along Highway 99 near SeaTac Airport, their bodies dumped in wooded areas and along the Green River that gave this killer his infamous name. So when Mary Ann Daniels turned up dead in early February 1989, she became one more victim in a region that was absolutely drowning in unsolved murders of vulnerable women. And the Everett Police Department had their hands full trying to solve a case that seemed straightforward at first, but would become maddeningly complex as every lead turned into a dead end. Because Mary Ann wasn't a random victim snatched off a highway, she was killed in her own home, in a transitional living facility where she'd been placed by her caseworker, a 33-year-old woman with a developmental disability who was trying to build a life for herself in a safe environment, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. The property manager found her face down on her bed, naked, with a ligature fashioned from 3 separate items wound tightly around her throat, a bra, a purse strap, and an electrical cord. The kind of overkill that speaks to rage, or perhaps a killer who wanted to make absolutely certain his victim couldn't escape or cry out. And the medical examiner would later determine that Mary Ann had likely died on January 28th, which meant her body had been lying there for 4 days before anyone discovered her. 4 days during which her killer went about his normal life, probably passing her door multiple times, knowing exactly what was on the other side. Now here's where this case gets its hooks into you, because the detectives working this murder in 1989 did everything right. They processed the crime scene meticulously. They collected DNA evidence from the ligatures. They interviewed everyone connected to Mary Ann, including 3 men who became persons of interest. The property manager who found her body, a man Mary Ann had previously been in a relationship with. and her neighbor, Joseph Andrew Jacques, who had moved into the subdivided house at the same address on the exact same day Mary Ann moved into her converted garage apartment. And when they sat down with Jacques on February 1st, he told them a story that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. He said he'd gone to work on the day Mary Ann was killed, come home to shower and change clothes, gone out to dinner alone, then spent the evening at a bar until closing time. And when they asked about his relationship with Mary Ann, he looked them straight in the eye and said they had no relationship beyond being casual neighbors. They'd lived in the same property for just 3 weeks. He barely knew her. And the detectives had no reason to disbelieve him because there was nothing in his background that raised red flags. He wasn't on their radar. He had no criminal history that would suggest he was capable of this kind of violence. So they noted his statement and moved on to other leads. But the DNA told a different story. Or at least it would have if the technology had existed in 1989 to read what that DNA was trying to tell them. Because male DNA was recovered from a cheek swab collected during Mary Ann's autopsy. And over the years, that DNA would be tested and retested as technology improved. And in 2011, that DNA profile excluded the property manager and the ex-boyfriend, and a third man who by then had emerged as a possible person of interest. But it didn't match anyone in CODIS, the combined DNA index system that law enforcement uses to compare DNA from crime scenes with DNA from convicted offenders and other crimes, which meant the killer was either someone who'd never been arrested and had their DNA entered into the system, or someone who'd managed to avoid getting caught for any crime that would require a DNA sample. And for 30 years, the case sat cold, while Mary Ann's family waited for answers, and Joseph Jacques lived his life in Mount Vernon, Washington, and later Las Vegas, Nevada, probably never imagining that the DNA he'd left behind would eventually become a time bomb ticking toward his arrest. The thing about cold cases that most people don't understand is that they're never really closed. They're just waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for someone to make a mistake, waiting for a witness to finally come forward with information they were too scared to share decades ago, waiting for that one detective who refuses to let go of a case that everyone else has given up on. And Mary Ann Daniels had that detective. Her name is Susan Logothetti, and she's become something of a legend in the Everett Police Department's cold case unit. A tenacious investigator who's been instrumental in solving multiple decades-old murders using the latest advances in DNA technology and forensic genetic genealogy. And when Detective Logothetti took another look at Mary Ann's case, she saw something that previous investigators hadn't seen simply because the technology didn't exist yet. She saw that the DNA evidence collected in 1989 could be used in a completely different way, not to compare against known offenders in CODIS, but to build a family tree that would lead investigators directly to the killer's front door, even if he'd never been arrested for anything in his life. This is where the science gets absolutely fascinating, because forensic genetic genealogy is revolutionizing how law enforcement solves cold cases, and it works like this. Scientists extract DNA from crime scene evidence and use a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile. Then that profile gets uploaded to public genealogy databases, not the law enforcement databases like CODIS, but the consumer DNA databases that millions of people use to trace their family heritage. Websites where people voluntarily upload their DNA, hoping to find long-lost relatives or learn about their ethnic background. And when a crime scene DNA profile is uploaded to these databases, the system searches for genetic matches. Not exact matches necessarily, but partial matches that indicate the crime scene DNA came from someone who's related to people in the database, maybe a third cousin or a second cousin twice removed. And then a forensic genetic genealogist takes those partial matches and starts building a family tree, working backward through generations to identify common ancestors. then working forward through the branches of that tree to identify all the living descendants who could possibly be the source of the crime scene DNA, and finally narrowing down that list based on age, geographic location, and other factors until you're left with a manageable number of suspects who can be investigated further. In Mary Ann's case, Detective Logothetti partnered with Othram, a Texas-based laboratory that specializes in using this cutting-edge technology to solve the most difficult cold cases. And in 2020, she submitted crime scene evidence to Othram, and their scientists worked their magic, developing DNA profiles that could be used for genetic genealogy. And then, forensic genetic genealogist Deb Stone took those profiles and dove into the databases, building family trees, following branches, eliminating possibilities, and slowly, methodically, the circle began to close around a man living in Nevada who had no idea that his distant relatives' decisions to upload their DNA to ancestry websites was about to destroy the life he'd built after getting away with murder. For more than 3 decades, by 2022, the genealogist had developed new leads that pointed to a specific family line, and Detective Logothetti launched a follow-up investigation that led her to Clark County, Nevada, to a man named Joseph Andrew Jaquez, the same man who'd been interviewed once by detectives in 1989 and then never contacted again, the neighbor who claimed he barely knew Mary Ann Daniels, the man who'd moved in the same day she did and was living just feet away from her when she was strangled to death. Now Detective Logothetti faced a challenge that every cold case investigator knows well. The genetic genealogy had given her a suspect, but she needed to confirm that this specific individual was actually the source of the crime scene DNA. And you can't just walk up to someone and demand a DNA sample without probable cause. So she had to get creative. And this is where police work becomes part detective work and part chess match. Because Logothetti reached out to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and asked for their help in obtaining what's called a covert DNA sample, which means collecting DNA from a suspect without their knowledge by gathering something they've discarded. A coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a water bottle, anything that might contain their DNA, and Las Vegas detectives agreed to help. And they set up surveillance on Joseph Jaquez, following him, watching him, waiting for the right opportunity. And that opportunity came at a restaurant when Jaquez ordered a beer, drank it, and left the bottle behind. And the moment he walked out that door, detectives moved in and collected that bottle. And it was carefully packaged and sent to the lab for analysis. And when the results came back, it was game over for Joseph Andrew Jaquez, because the DNA from that beer bottle matched the DNA from blood that had been found on the ligatures used to strangle Mary Ann Daniels 36 years earlier, on January 25th, 2025. 36 years and 3 weeks after Mary Ann Daniels was murdered, Joseph Andrew Jaquez was arrested in Clark County, Nevada, and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. And when Everett Police Chief John DeRoos announced the arrest, he praised Detective Logothetti's perseverance and dedication, saying that due to her hard work, this suspect will be held accountable nearly 4 decades later. And Mary Ann's family finally got the news they'd been waiting for since 1989. News that brought a complicated mix of emotions, because while they were grateful for closure, while they were relieved that someone would finally be held accountable, there was also the crushing weight of all those lost years, all those decades of wondering and waiting and living with the knowledge that somewhere out there a killer was walking free, while Mary Ann lay in her grave. Her sister Sandy Daniels Lundin released a statement that cut right to the heart of this tragedy, saying that Mary Ann had faced unfortunate circumstances while living in a transitional rental house where her social worker had placed her, that she should have been protected from this happening, but instead was put in danger. And in the end, Mary Ann lost her life. She had a hard life, and now she's at peace. And her brother Terry Lee Saline remembered Mary Ann as trusting, Carefree, someone who always believed the good in people. She has never been forgotten by her family, and those words paint a picture of a vulnerable woman who deserved protection and safety, who was doing her best to navigate a world that wasn't always kind to people with disabilities. And instead of finding the fresh start she deserved in that transitional housing facility, she found a killer living next door. Now let's talk about what transitional housing actually means and why Mary Ann ended up in that particular property. Because this is crucial to understanding not just her case, but the broader context of violence against vulnerable women in the Seattle area during the late 80s. Transitional housing is meant to be a bridge between institutional care or homelessness and independent living. It's supposed to provide a safe, supportive environment for people with disabilities or people recovering from addiction or people leaving abusive situations. Places where caseworkers can monitor progress and provide assistance, while residents learn to live independently. And Mary Ann's caseworker placed her in this converted garage that had been subdivided into 4 small living spaces. The main house had also been subdivided into multiple rental units, and this kind of informal, barely regulated housing was common in working-class neighborhoods throughout the Seattle area in the 80s. Property owners looking to maximize rental income would carve up single-family homes into as many units as possible, often without proper oversight or security measures. And vulnerable people like Mary Ann would end up in these situations because affordable housing options were limited and caseworkers were overwhelmed with massive caseloads and insufficient resources. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And here's the thing that makes this case even more tragic. Mary Ann moved into apartment number 3 in that converted garage on January 9th, 1989, and Joseph Jaquez moved into the subdivided main house on the exact same day. So they were both new tenants, both just settling in. And according to the charging documents, Jaquez told police they had no relationship beyond casual neighbors. But think about what that really means. 2 people moving into the same property on the same day, probably crossing paths while carrying boxes and furniture, maybe exchanging polite hellos or small talk about the weather. Maybe Mary Ann, in her trusting nature, smiled at him and said something friendly. Maybe she felt relieved to see another new tenant because it meant she wasn't alone in this unfamiliar place. And 19 days later, he murdered her. 19 days, less than 3 weeks. Which raises the absolutely chilling question of whether Jaquez targeted her specifically or whether this was opportunistic. Whether he saw a vulnerable woman with a disability living alone in that converted garage and recognized an easy victim, or whether something happened in those 19 days that triggered his violence. An interaction, a rejection, something that made him decide to kill her. And we may never know the answer because Jaquez isn't talking. He's lawyered up and maintaining his innocence, despite the DNA evidence that puts his blood on the murder weapon. But let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture of what was happening in the Seattle metropolitan area in 1989. Because Mary Ann's murder didn't happen in a vacuum, it happened during one of the darkest periods in Pacific Northwest history. A time when multiple serial killers were operating simultaneously and the bodies of murdered women were turning up with horrifying regularity. And to really understand the full scope of this nightmare, you need to understand that the Green River Killer Task Force had been working non-stop since 1982, when the first victims started appearing. And by 1989, they'd investigated hundreds of suspects, followed thousands of leads, and spent millions of dollars trying to catch a killer who seemed absolutely unstoppable. Gary Ridgway was still actively hunting women along the SeaTac Strip and dumping their bodies in remote locations. And detectives had interviewed him twice in 1983 after a potential victim's boyfriend reported seeing her get into a pickup truck matching Ridgway's vehicle. But they couldn't make anything stick because the DNA technology that would eventually catch him didn't exist yet. So he kept killing. The Green River Killer's reign of terror fundamentally changed how people in the Seattle area thought about safety. Because these weren't abstract crimes happening somewhere far away. These were local women, daughters and sisters and mothers, disappearing from familiar streets and turning up dead in places where people hiked and fished and lived their daily lives. And the constant drumbeat of news coverage about missing women and recovered bodies created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that permeated the entire region. People started locking their doors who'd never locked them before. Parents became hyper-vigilant about their teenage daughters' whereabouts. And there was a growing awareness that the Emerald City's reputation as a safe, progressive, livable place was being seriously tarnished by this epidemic of violence against women. And it wasn't just the Green River Killer, because on January 24th, 1989, exactly 1 week before Mary Ann's body was discovered, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida after 9 years on death row. And his execution made front-page news across the country because Bundy had become the face of American serial murder. The charming law student who used his good looks and intelligence to lure victims to their deaths. And Washington State had a particular connection to Bundy because this is where his killing spree began. 11 of his confirmed 30 victims were murdered in Washington. Young women who trusted him when he pretended to be injured or impersonated an authority figure. Women like Linda Ann Healy, who disappeared from her University of Washington basement apartment in 1974. Or Denise Naslund and Janice Ott, who vanished from Lake Sammamish State Park in broad daylight. So when Bundy died in that electric chair on January 24th, there was definitely a sense of justice being served, of a monster finally being held accountable. But there was also the sobering realization that Bundy's execution didn't bring back any of his victims, and it didn't stop the violence that continued to plague the region. Because just 1 week later, Mary Ann Daniels would be dead, and nobody knew that Gary Ridgway would keep killing for nearly another decade, until DNA advances finally led to his arrest in 2001. And the truth is that 1989 was peak paranoia time in the Seattle area, a moment when it felt like dangerous predators were everywhere and law enforcement was overwhelmed and outmatched by the sheer volume of unsolved cases. The Everett Police Department was part of this broader regional crisis, working their own cases while also staying alert for any connections to the Green River murders or other serial predators. And when Mary Ann's body was discovered, they had to consider all possibilities. Was this a one-off domestic situation? Was it connected to the Green River killings, even though Mary Ann didn't fit the typical victim profile? Was there another serial killer operating in Snohomish County that they didn't know about yet? And the fact that she was killed in her own home, rather than abducted from a public location, actually made the case more solvable in theory, because it suggested the killer was someone with access to her apartment. Someone she knew, or at least someone who knew where she lived. The detectives processing that crime scene in early February 1989 were thorough and professional, collecting evidence that would eventually solve the case 36 years later. But they were working with the technological limitations of their era. DNA testing existed, but it was primitive compared to what we have now. You could determine blood type and maybe exclude certain suspects, but you couldn't generate the kind of detailed genetic profile that would become standard in later decades. And genetic genealogy, the tool that ultimately caught Joseph Jacques, wasn't even a concept yet because the public genealogy databases that make it possible wouldn't exist for another 2 decades. So those detectives did everything they could with the tools available. They interviewed witnesses, they collected physical evidence, they followed leads. And when those leads dried up, the case went cold because there was nowhere else to go. The DNA they'd collected couldn't tell them who the killer was. It could only eliminate certain suspects. And Joseph Jacques wasn't even on their radar as someone to eliminate because he'd given a perfectly reasonable statement and had no criminal history and no obvious connection to Mary Ann beyond being her neighbor for 19 days. And this is where we need to talk about Joseph Andrew Jacques himself, because who is this man who allegedly strangled a disabled woman in her own bed and then walked away to live a normal life for 36 years? According to court records, he has no significant criminal history, just a misdemeanor conviction for reckless driving in King County in 1992, 3 years after Mary Ann's murder. Which means he wasn't the kind of obvious career criminal who would naturally attract police attention. He held down jobs, he moved from Everett to Mount Vernon and eventually to Las Vegas. He lived what appeared to be an ordinary life while carrying the secret of what he'd allegedly done on January 28, 1989. And that's actually one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. The idea that someone could commit such a brutal crime and then just blend back into society as if nothing happened, going to work every day, maybe having relationships and friendships, watching the news coverage about Mary Ann's unsolved murder and knowing that he was responsible, sleeping peacefully at night while Mary Ann's family suffered through decades of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. The psychological profile of someone who could do this is fascinating and terrifying, because we're not talking about a crime of passion here, not a sudden eruption of violence in the heat of an argument. We're talking about someone who allegedly strangled a woman with 3 different ligatures, which suggests planning and deliberation. The bra could have been grabbed in the moment, but adding the purse strap and electrical cord speaks to someone who wanted to make absolutely certain their victim was dead. Someone who took their time, who wasn't panicked or rushed, who had the cold-bloodedness to commit murder and then walk away and maintain his innocence for more than 3 decades, even when directly questioned by police. And there's another layer to this that's worth examining, which is the specific vulnerability of Mary Ann. As a victim, she had a developmental disability. She was living alone for possibly the first time in her life. She was in transitional housing, which meant she was in a state of change and uncertainty, and she was described by her family as trusting and believing the good in people, which are beautiful qualities that make someone a wonderful person, but also qualities that predators specifically target. Because people who are naturally trusting are easier to manipulate, easier to approach, easier to victimize. And the fact that Mary Ann was killed in her own apartment suggests either that her killer had a key or that she let him in, which raises the possibility that Jacques knocked on her door with some pretext, maybe asking to borrow something or claiming there was a problem with the plumbing or the electricity, some excuse that would get her to open that door. And once he was inside, the attack happened quickly and brutally. Now fast forward to 2022, 33 years after the murder, when forensic genetic genealogist Deb Stone is working with the DNA profiles developed by Othram Laboratories, building family trees in the genealogy databases, following genetic breadcrumbs through generations of ancestors and descendants, and at some point, a pattern emerges. Certain family names keep appearing, certain geographic locations, certain branches of a family tree that intersect with Snohomish County, Washington in the late 1980s, and the circle gets smaller and smaller until there's a short list of possible suspects who have the right age, the right location history, the right family connections, and Joseph Andrew Jacques is on that list. And when Detective Logothetti pulls up the old case file and sees that Jacques was interviewed in 1989, when she realizes that he was Mary Ann's neighbor, that he moved in the same day she did, that he had access and opportunity, everything clicks into place and suddenly they have a viable suspect after all these years. But having a suspect and proving a case are 2 different things, especially when you're trying to prosecute a crime that happened 36 years ago. Witnesses have died or their memories have faded. Physical evidence has degraded. The crime scene has long since been dismantled and rebuilt probably several times over. And the defendant's attorney will absolutely argue that it's impossible to get a fair trial after so much time has passed. How can Jacques defend himself against accusations from 1989 when potential alibi witnesses might be dead? when his own memories of that day have been lost to time, when the defense has no opportunity to conduct their own investigation of a fresh crime scene. These are the challenges that prosecutors face in cold cases, and it's why the DNA evidence becomes so absolutely crucial. Because the DNA doesn't forget, the DNA doesn't age or change its story. The DNA is scientific fact that can withstand the passage of time. And in this case, the DNA is devastating for Joseph Jacques because it's not just DNA from the crime scene in general. It's his blood on the ligatures that were used to strangle Mary Ann, which means he didn't just happen to be in the vicinity. He didn't just touch something that later got used in the crime. His blood was on the actual murder weapon. And the only way to explain that is either he was directly involved in killing her, or someone else used ligatures that somehow had his blood on them. And that second explanation strains credibility to the breaking point. The prosecution's case against Joseph Andrew Jacques is built on that single devastating piece of evidence, his DNA on the ligatures. And Snohomish County prosecutors made it clear in their charging documents that they're confident in this case despite its age. They specifically referenced another cold case from the area where a defendant named Terrence Miller committed suicide during his murder trial while out on bail. And prosecutors wrote that the state desires its day in court in this matter, which is legal language for we're not letting this guy slip away. We're going to trial, and we're going to get justice for Mary Ann Daniels, even if it takes another year or two to work through the court system. Jacques was booked into jail in Clark County, Nevada, and extradited to Snohomish County, Washington, where he's being held on first-degree murder charges. And his bail hearing was particularly interesting because prosecutors argued for high bail or no bail at all, citing the severity of the crime, the strength of the DNA evidence, and the fact that Jacques had already demonstrated a willingness to flee by moving from Washington to Nevada over the years. Now, his defense would argue that moving from one state to another for work or personal reasons isn't fleeing from justice, especially when he wasn't a suspect at the time. But prosecutors would counter that a man facing life in prison for a brutal murder has every incentive to disappear. And given that he's already 61 years old, he has nothing to lose by running because a life sentence at his age is effectively a death sentence. And here's where we need to talk about the broader implications of genetic genealogy in law enforcement, because Mary Ann's case is just one of dozens that have been solved using this technology in recent years. And it's revolutionizing cold case investigations in ways that seemed like science fiction just a decade ago. Think about it. For most of human history, if a murderer could avoid identification for even a few years, they were essentially home free. Witnesses would die or forget. Evidence would be lost or contaminated. Investigations would go cold, and cases would be closed, and killers would live out their lives, never facing consequences for what they'd done. But genetic genealogy has changed that calculus completely, because now your DNA is a permanent record that will eventually catch up with you. It might take 10 years or 20 years or 36 years like in Mary Ann's case. But if you left DNA at a crime scene, and that DNA was properly collected and preserved, you're living on borrowed time. It's only a matter of when the technology catches up, and when some detective decides to take another look at your cold case, and when your distant cousin decides to upload their DNA to a genealogy website to find out if they're Irish or Italian or descended from royalty. The Golden State Killer case in 2018 really opened people's eyes to the power of this technology. Joseph James DeAngelo had committed at least 13 murders and 50 rapes across California during the 70s and 80s, and had never been caught, despite one of the largest manhunts in American history. And then investigator Paul Holes partnered with a genetic genealogist, and they uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database called GED Match, and they got a hit on a distant relative. and from there they built a family tree that led them directly to D'Angelo, a former police officer living in suburban Sacramento. And when they arrested him in 2018, it sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and the criminal community, because suddenly every cold case with DNA evidence became potentially solvable. Every unsolved rape and murder from the past 40 years was back on the table, and criminals who thought they'd gotten away with it started looking over their shoulders, wondering if today would be the day the knock came on their door. And that's exactly what happened to Joseph Jacques in January 2025. He was living his life in Las Vegas, going about his business, maybe thinking about the murder sometimes, or maybe having convinced himself that it never happened, or that he'd never be caught. And then suddenly there are police at his door with an arrest warrant, and he's being extradited to Washington to face charges for something he allegedly did when he was 25 years old. And his entire world is collapsing because of a beer bottle he left at a restaurant, and distant relatives he probably doesn't even know who uploaded their DNA to ancestry websites. Now let's talk about Detective Susan Logothetti, because she deserves recognition for the incredible work she's done on multiple cold cases. And her story illustrates something important about how these cases actually get solved. It's not usually some dramatic breakthrough moment like you see in the movies. It's persistent, methodical, unglamorous police work by dedicated investigators who refuse to give up on victims, even decades after their deaths. Logothetti has been working cold cases for the Everett Police Department's Cold Case Unit, and before solving Mary Ann's case, she was instrumental in closing another murder from 1984. The killing of 42-year-old Judith Weaver. And the way she got DNA from that suspect is absolutely brilliant, and shows the creativity that modern cold case detectives have to employ. Logothetti and other undercover officers posed as representatives from a gum company who were doing market research on new flavors. And they approached their suspect and asked if he'd be willing to try some samples and give feedback. And of course he agreed, because who wouldn't help test new gum flavors? And he chewed the gum right in front of them, and they collected those pieces of chewed gum after he was done. And boom, they had his DNA, and it matched DNA found on Judith Weaver's body. And suddenly, a case that had been cold for 40 years was solved because of some creative thinking and a willingness to use every legal tool available. And in Mary Ann's case, Logothetti used a similar approach, working with Las Vegas police to conduct surveillance on Jacques and collect that discarded beer bottle. And this is all perfectly legal, as long as the police aren't trespassing or violating the suspect's Fourth Amendment rights. Because once you throw something away in a public place, you've abandoned any expectation of privacy in that item. The police can collect it and test it and use the results as evidence. And defense attorneys will argue that this is an invasion of privacy, that the police are being sneaky and underhanded. But courts have consistently ruled that you have no reasonable expectation of privacy in trash that you've discarded or items you've left behind in public spaces. So these covert DNA collection techniques are not only legal, but increasingly common in cold case investigations. The partnership between local police departments and specialized laboratories like Othram has also been crucial to solving these cases, because Othram has developed proprietary techniques for extracting usable DNA from degraded or contaminated evidence. The kind of samples that would have been worthless 10 years ago can now be sequenced and turned into detailed genetic profiles. And they've helped solve hundreds of cases across the country, identifying both unknown victims and unknown suspects. And their work is funded through a combination of sources, including law enforcement budgets, grants from state legislatures, and crowdfunding campaigns where ordinary citizens donate money to help solve specific cold cases that have captured public attention. In Mary Ann's case, the Washington state legislature provided critical funding that made the genetic genealogy testing possible. Governor Bob Ferguson, Attorney General Nick Brown, And state legislators recognized that solving cold cases provides closure for families and removes dangerous criminals from society and sends a message to future offenders that there's no statute of limitations on murder. You will be caught eventually, even if it takes decades. And that investment in forensic technology is paying dividends as case after case gets solved and families finally get answers about what happened to their loved ones. But we also need to acknowledge the privacy concerns that genetic genealogy raises. Because when you upload your DNA to a genealogy website, you're not just sharing information about yourself. You're sharing genetic information about your entire extended family. Your parents and siblings and cousins and all your ancestors going back generations. And you're potentially putting all those relatives at risk of being identified as suspects in criminal investigations, even if they had nothing to do with any crime. And while most people would say that's a reasonable trade-off if it helps catch murderers and rapists, there are legitimate concerns about mission creep and the potential for this technology to be misused. What if, in the future, governments start using genetic genealogy not just to solve violent crimes, but to identify people who committed minor offenses, or who participated in political protests, or who have genetic markers that suggest they might commit crimes in the future? What if insurance companies get access to these databases and start denying coverage based on genetic predispositions to certain diseases? What if authoritarian regimes use genetic genealogy to track dissidents and their families? These are real concerns that ethicists and legal scholars are grappling with. And the reality is that the technology has advanced much faster than the laws and regulations that govern its use. And we're in this Wild West period where law enforcement is using these tools aggressively to solve old cases, while privacy advocates are raising red flags about the long-term implications. The genetic genealogy companies themselves have tried to walk a careful line. GEDmatch, for example, changed its terms of service after the Golden State Killer case to make it clear that law enforcement might access the database, and users now have the option to opt out of law enforcement, matching if they're concerned about privacy. But the default setting is to allow law enforcement access, and most users probably don't even realize they're agreeing to let police search their family tree for potential murder suspects. And companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA have policies that they won't cooperate with law enforcement unless served with a valid warrant. But GEDmatch and some other databases are more open to law enforcement use, and genetic genealogists have become skilled at using whatever tools are available to build family trees and identify suspects. Now let's get back to 1989 and the specific context of the Seattle area during that period, because understanding what was happening in the region helps explain why Mary Ann's case went cold and why so many other cases from that era remain unsolved. The simple truth is that law enforcement was completely overwhelmed by the volume of violent crime, particularly crimes against women, and resources were stretched impossibly thin. The Green River Task Force alone employed dozens of detectives and spent millions of dollars over 2 decades trying to catch Gary Ridgway. And that was just one serial killer. There were also numerous unsolved murders that weren't definitively linked to the Green River killings, but might have been. And there were other serial predators operating in the region. And there were domestic violence homicides and gang-related killings and drug-related murders. And small police departments like Everett were doing their best with limited budgets and limited personnel and limited technology. The Wah-Mee massacre had happened in February 1983. Just 6 years before Mary Ann's murder, when 3 armed men robbed a gambling club in Seattle's Chinatown and shot 13 people execution-style, killing 12 of them, and it was the deadliest mass shooting in Seattle history until the Capitol Hill massacre in 2006. And the city was still processing that trauma when the Green River killings started dominating headlines. And Ted Bundy's execution in January 1989 brought all those old fears back to the surface, reminding everyone that Washington state had a particular problem with serial killers. Something about the Pacific Northwest seemed to attract or produce these predators. Whether it was the dense forests that provided perfect body dump sites, or the transient population moving up and down Interstate 5, or the large number of vulnerable women working in the sex trade, or some combination of all these factors. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough, which is the class dimension of who got attention when they went missing or turned up dead. Because if you were a young white woman from a middle-class family who disappeared, that made front-page news and sparked massive search efforts and got extensive media coverage. But if you were a sex worker or a runaway or a woman with a drug addiction or a developmental disability, your case might get a few paragraphs in the local paper and then fade from public consciousness. And this disparity in attention and resources absolutely affected which cases got solved and which ones went cold. Gary Ridgway specifically targeted women he thought society wouldn't miss, sex workers and runaways, and he was right that these victims didn't generate the same level of public outrage and investigative urgency as other murders. And Mary Ann Daniels fell into a similar category. She was a disabled woman living in transitional housing, not someone with powerful family connections or political influence. Not someone whose disappearance would make national news. And while the Everett Police Department absolutely worked her case professionally and thoroughly, it didn't get the sustained attention and resources that cases involving more privileged victims might have received. This is an uncomfortable truth about the criminal justice system, that not all victims are treated equally. That some deaths matter more than others in terms of investigative priority and media coverage and public concern. And advocates for victims' rights have been pointing this out for decades, noting that missing white woman syndrome is real and affects everything, from which cases get featured on television news, magazines to which cold cases get selected, for genetic genealogy testing when resources are limited. And the good news is that there's been some progress on this front, with advocacy groups pushing for equal attention to all victims, regardless of race or class or lifestyle, and with federal funding becoming available specifically for cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and people, and with cold case units being more mindful about selecting a diverse range of cases to work, rather than just the ones that will generate positive publicity. Detective Logathetti and the Everett Police Department deserve credit for pursuing Mary Ann's case with the same vigor they'd give to any victim, for refusing to let her case gather dust just because she was a vulnerable woman without powerful advocates, for recognizing that Mary Ann's life mattered and her family deserved answers, and justice demanded that her killer be held accountable. And now, after 36 years, that's finally happening. Joseph Andrew Jaquez is sitting in a jail cell waiting for trial, and the evidence against him is strong enough that prosecutors are confident they'll get a conviction despite the passage of time. The legal proceedings are going to be fascinating to watch, because this is a test case for how far genetic genealogy can go in securing convictions in very old cold cases. The defense will absolutely challenge the DNA evidence. They'll bring in their own experts to question the chain of custody, to argue that the samples could have been contaminated or degraded over 36 years, to suggest that the genetic genealogy techniques aren't scientifically sound, to claim that the covert collection of the beer bottle violated Jaquez's rights. They'll throw everything at the wall to see what sticks, because that's their job, and their client is facing life in prison. And the prosecution will have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the DNA evidence is reliable, and that Joseph Jaquez is the man who strangled Mary Ann Daniels. With those 3 ligatures back in January 1989, the trial will likely hinge on the prosecution's ability to tell a compelling story that connects all the pieces. The DNA evidence is the foundation, but they'll also need to establish opportunity and access. They'll need to show that Jacques lived in the same property as Mary Ann, that he moved in the same day she did, that he had the physical capability to commit this crime, that his alibi for January 28, 1989 is either unverifiable or demonstrably false. And they'll need to explain to a jury how genetic genealogy works in a way that's understandable but scientifically rigorous. Because you can bet the defense will try to make it sound like some kind of voodoo pseudoscience rather than legitimate forensic methodology that's been validated in courts across the country. And the defense will have their own narrative. They'll paint Joseph Jacques as an innocent man being railroaded by overzealous prosecutors who are using junk science to close a cold case and boost their conviction statistics. They'll point out that he has no criminal history beyond a single reckless driving ticket, that he's lived openly under his own name for 36 years without trying to hide or flee, that innocent people's DNA can end up at crime scenes through secondary transfer, that maybe he touched something that later got used to fashion those ligatures, or maybe the evidence was contaminated during collection or storage over all those decades. And they'll argue that it's fundamentally unfair to prosecute someone for a crime that happened before most current jurors were even born. How can anyone be expected to remember where they were and what they were doing on a specific day 36 years ago? How can Jacques possibly defend himself when potential alibi witnesses are dead or their memories are unreliable? After so much time has passed, these are legitimate defense arguments that prosecutors will need to overcome. And the key will be demonstrating that Jacques' blood on the ligatures isn't explainable through innocent means. Blood doesn't transfer like touch DNA. You don't leave blood on someone else's belongings unless there's been an injury or a violent struggle. And if Jacques had some innocent reason for his blood being on Mary Ann's bra or purse strap or an electrical cord from her apartment, what would that reason possibly be? Did he cut himself while helping her move furniture? Did they have some interaction we don't know about where he injured himself in her presence? And if so, why didn't he mention that to police when they interviewed him the day her body was discovered? Why did he say they had no relationship beyond being casual neighbors? If he'd actually been in her apartment helping her with something or interacting with her in a way that would explain his blood on her possessions. The more you think about it, the harder it becomes to construct an innocent explanation for that DNA evidence. And that's what prosecutors will hammer home to the jury, that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. And the simplest explanation here is that Joseph Jacques strangled Mary Ann Daniels and his blood got on the ligatures during the struggle. Maybe she fought back and scratched him. Maybe he cut himself somehow during the attack. Maybe he had a small wound that reopened during the physical exertion of strangling someone to death. But however it happened, his blood ended up on the murder weapon, and there's really no getting around that fact. Now let's talk about the impact this arrest has had on Mary Ann's family. Because for 36 years they've been living in limbo, unable to fully grieve and move on because there was never closure, never justice, never even a full understanding of what happened to their loved one. Sandy Daniels Lundin and Terry Lee Celine have carried this weight for more than 3 decades, wondering if the person who killed their sister was someone they passed on the street. Someone who was still out there living a normal life while Mary Ann was in the ground. And you can hear both relief and anger in Sandy's statement about how Mary Ann should have been protected by her social worker, how she was put in danger instead of being kept safe. And that's a legitimate grievance, because Mary Ann was a vulnerable adult who needed support and supervision, and the system that was supposed to protect her failed. Whether it was inadequate screening of the housing situation, insufficient oversight of her living conditions, failure to ensure the property had adequate security measures, or just bad luck that put her in proximity to a predator, the system failed Mary Ann Daniels, and she paid for that failure with her life. And Terry's remembrance of Mary Ann as trusting and believing the good in people is heartbreaking, because those are beautiful qualities that should be celebrated and protected, not qualities that make someone a target for violence. But we live in a world where predators specifically seek out people who are trusting and kind and vulnerable. And that's what makes crimes like this so particularly evil. The perpetrator doesn't just take a life. They exploit the best qualities in their victim. They weaponize kindness and trust and use it against someone who deserves protection. The arrest has brought some measure of peace to Mary Ann's family, but it's complicated peace. Because yes, they finally have answers, and yes, someone is being held accountable. But it doesn't bring Mary Ann back. It doesn't give them back those 36 years of wondering and waiting. It doesn't erase the trauma of knowing that for more than 3 decades, a killer was walking free while their sister was dead. And there's also the bitter recognition that if genetic genealogy had existed in 1989, this case would have been solved immediately, and Joseph Jacques would have spent the last 36 years in prison instead of living as a free man. Think about all the holidays he celebrated while Mary Ann's family gathered with an empty chair at the table. Think about all the life milestones he experienced. Birthdays, and maybe marriages, and maybe children or grandchildren. While Mary Ann never got to experience any of that because her life was cut short at 33 years old. And there's no way to get that time back, no way to make it right. All you can do is ensure that justice is finally served, even if it comes decades too late. And Mary Ann's case is just one of many that are being solved through genetic genealogy in the Pacific Northwest. The region has become something of a hotspot for cold case breakthroughs because of the combination of factors. You've got decades worth of unsolved murders from the serial killer era of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You've got evidence that was properly collected and preserved, even if the technology didn't exist to fully analyze it at the time. You've got dedicated cold case units in various police departments who are willing to invest time and resources into old cases. And you've got state-level funding and support for forensic genetic genealogy work. And all of this is coming together to produce result after result. Case after case being cleared, families getting closure, killers being identified and arrested. In November 2024, Pierce County detectives solved another cold case from 1988. The murder of a teenage girl whose body was found near the Puyallup River. And they used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect named Guillot Jr., who had died before he could be arrested. But at least the family got answers, and the case was officially cleared. And in that case, like Mary Ann's case, the victim was described as a stranger abduction. The killer had no connection to his victim, just saw an opportunity and took it, which is absolutely terrifying, because it means you can do everything right. You can be careful and aware and take precautions, and still end up in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with someone who decides to kill you. The Whatcom County case of Amanda Mandy Stavik is another example. She disappeared in November 1989, the same year Mary Ann was killed. She went for a jog with her family dog and never came home. The dog returned without her, and search teams found her body in the Nooksack River. She'd been kidnapped and raped and murdered, and that case stayed cold for 28 years. Until DNA advances led to the arrest of Timothy Forrest Bass in 2017. He was 50 years old when they arrested him, living in the same small community where he'd killed an 18-year-old girl back in '89. And the people who knew him were shocked because he seemed like a normal guy. He went to work, he had relationships, he was part of the community, and nobody suspected that he was a murderer. And that's the thing about these cases. The killers often aren't obvious monsters. They're people who blend in, people who have jobs and families and seemingly normal lives, people who are skilled at compartmentalizing, at separating the terrible thing they did from their everyday existence, at convincing themselves that it didn't really happen, or that they had a good reason, or that the victim somehow deserved it, or that they've moved on and become a different person so they shouldn't be held accountable for something they did decades ago, but the DNA doesn't care about any of those rationalizations. The DNA is just cold, hard science that says you were there, you did this, you left evidence behind, and now you're going to face consequences. And that's why genetic genealogy is such a powerful tool, because it cuts through all the lies and excuses and self-justification that criminals use to avoid accountability. It connects them directly to the crime scene in a way that's nearly impossible to refute. And it's solving cases that everyone thought were unsolvable. Cases where the leads had dried up, where witnesses had died, where the trail had gone completely cold. And suddenly, there's a breakthrough and an arrest, and a family finally gets to see justice served. The Green River Killer case is the ultimate example of this. Because Gary Ridgway was interviewed multiple times during the 1980s. He was a suspect. He was on the task force's radar. But they couldn't make the evidence connect until DNA technology advanced to the point where they could definitively match him to multiple victims. And when they arrested him in 2001, it was like a weight lifted off the entire region. Because for nearly 20 years, the Green River Killer had been this boogeyman figure, this unseen predator who could strike at any time. And women throughout the Seattle area had lived with that fear, had changed their behaviors, had looked over their shoulders, had warned their daughters to be careful. And finally, knowing who he was and seeing him in custody and hearing him confess to 48 murders brought a sense of closure, even though it couldn't bring back any of the victims or undo any of the trauma. And Ridgway's case also illustrates something important about the nature of these predators, which is that they often continue offending until they're caught. Ridgway killed from 1982 through 1998, 16 years of active killing. And he probably would have continued if DNA hadn't caught up with him. Because these aren't crimes of circumstance or opportunity. These are compulsive behaviors by people who have something fundamentally wrong with their wiring, something that makes them capable of taking human life without remorse. And the scary thing is that most of them appear completely normal on the surface. Ridgway held down a job at a truck painting company for decades. He was married multiple times. He had a son. His co-workers described him as quiet but normal. Nobody suspected that this mild-mannered truck painter was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. And that's the lesson that law enforcement learned from cases like Ridgway and Bundy and all the others, that you can't profile your way to these killers based on appearance or behavior. They come in all shapes and sizes and backgrounds. The only way to catch them is through good old-fashioned detective work combined with cutting-edge forensic science. The partnership between human investigators and scientific technology is what's driving all these cold case solutions. You need the technology to generate the DNA profiles and the genetic genealogy matches, but you also need experienced detectives who know how to work leads, who can interview witnesses effectively, who understand criminal behavior and can construct a prosecutable case. And you need prosecutors who are willing to take on difficult old cases where the evidence is complicated and the defendant will have strong legal arguments about fairness and due process. And you need judges who will allow these cases to move forward and rule appropriately on evidentiary challenges. And you need juries who can understand complex scientific testimony and make decisions based on evidence, rather than emotion or sympathy for an elderly defendant who's being prosecuted for something that happened when he was young. The entire criminal justice system has to work together to solve these cold cases and bring them to trial. And that's happening more and more frequently as genetic genealogy becomes a standard tool in the investigator's toolkit. Police departments are partnering with labs like Othram and Parabon Nanolabs that specialize in forensic genetic genealogy. State legislatures are appropriating funding for cold case DNA testing. Prosecutors are developing expertise in trying cases based on genetic evidence, and judges are becoming more comfortable with the science behind these techniques. And the impact extends beyond just solving individual cases, because every arrest and conviction sends a message to anyone who's committed a violent crime and thinks they've gotten away with it. The message is clear: we're coming for you. It might take 5 years or 10 years or 36 years, but if you left DNA at a crime scene, we will eventually identify you and arrest you and prosecute you. There is no statute of limitations on murder. There is no safe harbor where you can hide and wait for everyone to forget. The evidence is stored in freezers and filing cabinets, waiting for technology to catch up. Waiting for that one detective to pull your case file and decide that today is the day we take another run at this. Waiting for your cousin or your nephew or your distant relative to upload their DNA to a genealogy website. And when all those factors align, your world is going to come crashing down, and you're going to have to answer for what you did all those years ago when you thought you were safe. This is the new reality of law enforcement in the 21st century, and it's already having an effect on criminal behavior, because potential offenders now have to consider that even if they avoid arrest for years or decades, eventually science will catch up with them. Eventually their DNA will be their undoing, and that knowledge might be enough to deter some crimes. Though probably not the kind of compulsive predatory violence we're talking about in cases like Mary Ann Daniels and Amanda Stavik and the Green River victims, because those killers aren't rational actors weighing costs and benefits. They're driven by urges and compulsions that override normal risk assessment. But for crimes of opportunity, for domestic violence that escalates to murder, for sexual assaults where the perpetrator thinks they can avoid identification, the knowledge that DNA is permanent evidence that will eventually lead back to them might make some people think twice, might make them walk away from a situation that could turn violent, might make them choose a different path. And if genetic genealogy prevents even a handful of murders by creating this deterrent effect, then it's worth all the money and effort being invested in the technology. The cost-benefit analysis is pretty straightforward. You spend a few $1,000s on DNA testing and genetic genealogy for a cold case. You identify a killer who might still be dangerous. You get them off the streets before they can hurt anyone else. You give closure to a family that's been suffering for decades. You demonstrate that the criminal justice system takes all victims seriously, regardless of how much time has passed. You send a message to the community that law enforcement doesn't give up on unsolved cases, and you potentially deter future crimes by showing that there's no escaping justice. All of that for the cost of some lab work and detective hours, which is frankly a bargain compared to the social costs of unsolved murders and unpunished criminals walking around free. Now let's circle back to where we started, which is the title of this entire story: Seattle 1989, Cold Case Solved, and the Emerald City's Tarnished Reputation. Because that's what all of this comes down to. The way that a city's identity can be shaped by violence. The way that a region's image can be forever altered by the crimes that happen there. And the way that solving these old cases is part of a larger process of healing and restoration. Seattle has always marketed itself as a progressive, livable, beautiful city. The Emerald City surrounded by water and mountains. Home to coffee culture and tech innovation and grunge music and outdoor recreation. But underneath that glossy exterior, there's always been a darker history. A shadow side that includes some of the most notorious serial killers in American history and dozens of unsolved murders that cast doubt on whether this place is really as safe and idyllic as the tourism brochures suggest. The 1980s were particularly brutal for the Seattle area's reputation. You had Ted Bundy's crimes coming to light and his execution, reminding everyone that this charming law student had started his killing spree right here in Washington. You had the Green River Killer terrorizing the region for nearly 2 decades. You had the Wami Massacre and various other high-profile violent crimes. And the cumulative effect was that people started questioning whether Seattle was really the progressive paradise it claimed to be, or whether there was something fundamentally broken in a place that seemed to produce or attract so many violent predators. And the thing is, Seattle's not unique in this regard. Every major city has a violent crime problem. Every region has its share of unsolved murders and missing persons cases. But Seattle got particularly unlucky with the concentration of serial killers and the media attention those cases generated. And that attention created a perception problem that the city has been trying to overcome ever since. How do you attract businesses and residents and tourists when people associate your city with the Green River Killer and Ted Bundy? How do you convince people that this is a safe place to live and raise families when there are documentary series and true crime podcasts constantly rehashing these old crimes and keeping them in the public consciousness? The answer is that you solve the cases. You demonstrate that law enforcement is competent and dedicated, that they don't give up on victims even decades after the crime, that justice might be delayed, but it's not denied. And every time a cold case gets solved, like Marianne Daniels' case just did, it's a small victory for the city's reputation. It's proof that the system works eventually, that criminals don't get away with murder forever, that Seattle and its surrounding communities take violence seriously and commit resources to solving these cases no matter how much time has passed. Detective Logathetti's work on Marianne's case and the Judith Weaver case and other cold cases is helping to rehabilitate Everett's reputation as a place that cares about all its residents, including vulnerable people like Marianne who don't have powerful advocates, and the broader regional effort to solve Green River murders and other serial crimes is helping to close that dark chapter of Pacific Northwest history. We're never going to completely erase the stain that Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway left on this region's reputation. Those names are forever associated with Seattle, and the damage is done. But what we can do is demonstrate that we've learned from those cases, that we've improved our investigative techniques, that we're using the most advanced forensic technology available, that we're committed to justice for all victims, regardless of who they are or how long ago they died. And there's something deeply satisfying about seeing these cases solved decades later using technology that didn't exist when the crimes occurred. It's like the universe finally balancing the scales, like science and persistence and dedication finally overcoming evil and violence and the arrogance of killers who thought they'd gotten away with it. Joseph Jacques allegedly strangled Marianne Daniels in January 1989 and walked away thinking he was safe, thinking that as long as he kept his mouth shut and lived a quiet life, nobody would ever connect him to that crime. And he was right for 36 years. Technology wasn't advanced enough to catch him. Witnesses didn't come forward with information that would break the case open. He slipped through the cracks and got to live a normal life while Marianne's family suffered. But then genetic genealogy came along and changed everything. And suddenly all those old assumptions about being safe if you could avoid arrest for a few years, all those calculations about statutes of limitations and fading memories and lost evidence, all of that became irrelevant because the DNA was still there, preserved in evidence lockers, waiting for science to catch up, waiting for someone like Detective Logathetti to take another look at the case file, waiting for a forensic genetic genealogist like Deb Stone to build the family trees that would lead directly to the killer. And when all those pieces finally came together in 2025, 36 years after the crime, justice finally caught up with Joseph Andrew Jacques, and he's now facing the consequences he should have faced in 1989. The trial is going to be a major test of how courts handle very old cold cases, prosecuted primarily on genetic genealogy evidence. And legal scholars and law enforcement agencies across the country will be watching closely to see how it plays out, because the outcome will influence how aggressively prosecutors pursue other ancient cold cases, how judges rule on evidentiary challenges to genetic genealogy, how juries respond to complex scientific testimony about DNA matching and family tree building, and whether defense attorneys can successfully argue that it's fundamentally unfair to prosecute someone for a crime committed so long ago that memories have faded and witnesses have died and the defendant has no realistic way to defend himself. The prosecutors in Snohomish County are confident they have a strong case. They've got the DNA evidence, which is the gold standard. They've got the timeline showing that Jaques had access and opportunity. They've got the fact that he was interviewed by police the day the body was discovered and didn't mention anything that would explain his blood being on the murder weapon. They've got experts who can explain genetic genealogy in terms a jury can understand. And they've got the emotional weight of Mary Ann's story, a vulnerable, disabled woman who trusted the system to keep her safe and was betrayed by that trust. And you can bet they'll make sure the jury understands exactly who Mary Ann Daniels was as a person. Not just a victim, but a real human being, with a family who loved her and dreams she never got to pursue, and a life that was stolen from her by someone who allegedly exploited her vulnerability. The defense will do their best to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They'll bring in their own DNA experts to question the methods and the chain of custody. They'll argue that 36 years is too long to expect anyone to defend themselves against criminal charges. They'll try to humanize Joseph Jaques as a 61-year-old man with no criminal history who's being railroaded by prosecutors looking for a win. But it's going to be an uphill battle because that DNA evidence is devastating. And unless they can provide a plausible, innocent explanation for how Jaques's blood ended up on the ligatures used to strangle Mary Ann, they're fighting a losing battle. And even if by some miracle Jaques is acquitted, even if a jury decides the evidence isn't strong enough, or the passage of time has made it impossible to get a fair trial, the fact that this case was solved and prosecuted still matters. It still sends a message. It still provides some measure of closure for Mary Ann's family. And it still demonstrates that law enforcement is committed to solving these old cases. But realistically, the chances of acquittal seem slim, given the strength of the DNA evidence and the thoroughness of the investigation. Prosecutors wouldn't have brought these charges if they weren't confident of getting a conviction. They know the stakes are high, and they know the defense will fight hard. But they believe in their case, and they believe justice is finally within reach for Mary Ann Daniels. As we record this in late September 2025, Jaques is awaiting trial in Snohomish County. His attorneys are presumably preparing their defense strategy. Prosecutors are lining up their witnesses and experts, and Mary Ann's family is preparing themselves emotionally for the ordeal of a trial where they'll have to relive the worst day of their lives and hear graphic details about how their sister died. But they're willing to go through that process because they want justice, they want accountability, they want the world to know that Mary Ann's life mattered and her death wasn't going to be forgotten or swept under the rug. The broader work of solving cold cases continues throughout the region. Othram Laboratories is working on multiple cases in Washington state. Detectives in various jurisdictions are reviewing old case files, looking for opportunities to apply genetic genealogy. State funding continues to flow for forensic DNA testing. And families of victims who've been waiting decades for answers are holding on to hope that their cases might be next. That maybe this year or next year they'll get the phone call they've been waiting for. The call that says we've identified a suspect, we're making an arrest. We're finally getting justice for your loved one. And sometimes that call comes with the disappointing news that the suspect died years ago, so there won't be a trial. But even then it's better than not knowing. Even then the family gets closure and the case gets officially cleared. And there's at least some satisfaction in knowing who did it, even if they can't be punished. The identified remains keep coming too, because genetic genealogy isn't just useful for identifying suspects. It's equally valuable for identifying unknown victims, giving names back to people who've been Jane Does and John Does for decades, allowing families to finally bury their loved ones properly and know what happened to them. And in January 2025, the Thurston County Sheriff's Office announced they'd identified remains found back in 2009 as Donald Myrrell Nelson, who disappeared in February 1989, the same year Mary Ann was killed. And that identification was made possible through the same kind of genetic genealogy that caught Joseph Jacques, showing how versatile and powerful this technology really is. The Seattle area is slowly working through its backlog of unsolved cases from the dark years of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And with each solved case, the region's reputation gets a little bit better. The narrative shifts from look at all these unsolved murders to look at how dedicated law enforcement is to solving these old cases. Look at how we're using cutting-edge science to get justice for victims. Look at how we never give up. And that's a much better story to tell about Seattle and the Emerald City. Not that we're a place where violence happens and killers get away with it, but that we're a place where justice might be delayed, but it eventually comes. Where detectives like Susan Logothetti work tirelessly on behalf of victims who have no voice. Where communities come together to fund forensic testing and support cold case investigations. Where families can hold on to hope even after decades of waiting, because they know that someone somewhere is still working their case, still looking at the evidence, still trying to find that breakthrough that will finally bring answers. Mary Ann Daniels deserved better than what happened to her in January 1989. She deserved to live a full life, to be safe in her own home, to trust that the people around her weren't going to hurt her. And she deserved justice that came quickly instead of 36 years later. But we can't change the past. All we can do is make sure that in the present we're doing everything possible to solve these cases and prevent future ones. And that means continuing to invest in forensic technology, continuing to train detectives in the latest investigative techniques, continuing to fund cold case units that do this difficult and often heartbreaking work, and continuing to remember the victims not just as statistics or case numbers, but as real people who had families and dreams and lives that mattered. So here's what we know as of today. September 29, 2025, Joseph Andrew Jacques, 61 years old, has been charged with first-degree premeditated murder in the death of Mary Ann Daniels. He's being held in Snohomish County on high bail. He's awaiting trial. The evidence against him includes DNA from his blood found on the ligatures used to strangle Mary Ann. That DNA match was made possible through forensic genetic genealogy and confirmed through a covert collection of a discarded beer bottle. Prosecutors are confident in their case. The defense will put up a fight, and Mary Ann's family is finally going to see someone held accountable for her death after 36 years of waiting. This case represents everything that was wrong with the Seattle area in 1989. The violence against vulnerable women, the overwhelmed law enforcement agencies, the cases that went cold because technology wasn't advanced enough to solve them. But it also represents everything that's right about law enforcement in 2025. The dedication to never giving up on victims, the willingness to use cutting-edge science, the commitment to justice no matter how much time has passed, and the recognition that every life matters, including and especially the lives of people like Mary Ann, who are often overlooked and undervalued by society. The Emerald City's reputation was indeed tarnished by the violence of those dark decades, by Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway and all the other predators who terrorized this region, by the dozens of unsolved murders that made people question whether Seattle was really as safe and progressive as it claimed to be. But that reputation is being slowly restored through cases like this, through the tireless work of detectives like Susan Logothetti, through the scientific breakthroughs that make genetic genealogy possible, through the families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten, and through communities that demand justice and support the resources needed to achieve it. So maybe the story of Seattle 1989 isn't ultimately about the tarnished reputation. Maybe it's about the redemption that comes decades later when science and persistence finally catch up with evil. When a beer bottle left in a Las Vegas restaurant becomes the key to solving a murder that happened when most of today's adults weren't even born. When a disabled woman named Mary Ann Daniels, who trusted people and believed in the good, finally gets justice, even though it came 36 years too late. And when a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder discovers that there really is no escape. That the evidence he left behind in 1989 was just waiting patiently for technology to catch up. Waiting for Detective Logothetti to pull that case file one more time. Waiting for Deb Stone to build those family trees. Waiting for science to speak the truth that Joseph Andrew Jacques allegedly strangled Mary Ann Daniels. And now, finally, after more than 3 decades, he's going to answer for what he did. That's the story of Mary Ann Daniels. That's the story of Seattle, 1989. That's the story of how genetic genealogy is changing everything we thought we knew about cold cases and justice and the possibility of escape. And it's a story that's still being written as Jacques awaits trial, and prosecutors prepare their case, and Mary Ann's family braces themselves for the legal proceedings ahead. But at least now there's movement, at least now there's progress. At least now there's hope that justice will finally be served. And in the end, that's what this is all about. Not revenge, not punishment for its own sake, but the fundamental human need for answers and accountability, and the recognition that Mary Ann Daniels was a person who mattered, whose death mattered, whose life should be remembered not just as a cold case statistic, but as a human being who deserved better than what happened to her on January 28, 1989, in a transitional housing apartment in Everett, Washington, where she should have been safe but instead encountered evil in the form of her neighbor who allegedly took everything from her and thought he'd never have to pay the price. Until a beer bottle and genetic genealogy and one determined detective proved him wrong 36 years later. Let's dig deeper into what makes this case so significant beyond just the individual tragedy of Mary Ann Daniels. Because we're living through a revolution in criminal justice right now, and most people don't fully grasp how transformative genetic genealogy really is. Think about it this way. For the entire history of human civilization until about 2018, if you committed a murder and managed to avoid arrest for 5 or 10 years, you were essentially home free. Sure, your case might remain technically open. Sure, detectives might periodically review the file. But realistically, the chances of being caught decreased exponentially with each passing year. Witnesses died or forgot crucial details, physical evidence degraded or was lost, investigative priorities shifted to newer cases, and eventually your cold case became one folder among thousands gathering dust in some storage facility. And the killer got to live out their life knowing they'd beaten the system. Knowing they'd taken someone's life and faced no consequences. And that knowledge probably ate at some of them, kept them up at night wondering if today would be the day the knock came on their door. But for others, like Joseph Jacques allegedly was, they just moved on, compartmentalized, convinced themselves it never happened, or they had good reasons, or the victim somehow deserved it, and they built new lives on top of that buried secret. But genetic genealogy has fundamentally altered that equation. It's created a situation where there's literally no statute of limitations on DNA evidence. Your genetic code is a permanent signature that you leave behind at crime scenes. And even if it takes 50 years for technology to advance to the point where that signature can be read and traced back to you, it will eventually happen. You're living on borrowed time from the moment you leave biological evidence behind. And this has profound implications, not just for solving old cases, but for deterring future crimes. Because rational criminals now have to factor in the reality that even if they avoid immediate detection, even if they clean the crime scene and dispose of evidence and create alibis, if they leave any DNA behind, they will eventually be caught. It might take a year or a decade or 3 decades, but the science will catch up with them. And that knowledge changes the risk-reward calculation for anyone contemplating a violent crime. Of course, most violent criminals aren't rational actors carefully weighing risks and benefits. Crimes of passion happen in the heat of the moment. Sexual predators are driven by compulsions they can't control. Serial killers have psychological profiles that make them incapable of the kind of long-term risk assessment that would be deterred by the threat of future genetic genealogy identification. But still, on the margins, this technology is almost certainly preventing some crimes by making it clear that there's no escape. And even if it only prevents a handful of murders, that's still lives. Saved and families spared the trauma that Mary Ann's family has endured. Now, let's talk about the actual mechanics of how Detective Logothetti built the case against Joseph. Jacques, after the genetic genealogy, gave her a suspect, because getting a name from a genealogist is just the starting point. You then have to conduct a full investigation to establish that this specific individual had means, motive, and opportunity. You have to place them at the scene. You have to eliminate alternative explanations. You have to build a prosecutable case that will stand up in court. And in a case this old, that's extraordinarily challenging. So Logothetti would have started by pulling every piece of documentation she could find about Jacques' life in January 1989. Employment records showing where he worked, rental agreements showing where he lived, utility bills, phone records if they still exist, any paper trail that confirms he was living at the same address as Mary Ann when she was killed. And modern digital databases make this easier than it would have been even 10 years ago, because so much historical information has been digitized and indexed and made searchable. But there are still gaps. Records get lost or destroyed. Companies go out of business and their files disappear. People move and their trail goes cold. She would have also tried to track down anyone who knew Jacques in 1989. Former co-workers, friends, other tenants in that subdivided house. The property manager who discovered Mary Ann's body. Anyone who might remember interactions between Jacques and Mary Ann, or who could provide information about Jacques' behavior around the time of the murder. Did he seem nervous or agitated? Did he suddenly move out shortly after the killing? Did he ever say anything suspicious? And this is where the passage of time becomes a real obstacle, because 36 years later, many of those potential witnesses are dead, and the ones who are still alive often have fragmented memories. They remember the broad outlines of what happened. Everyone remembers that a woman was murdered in the building, but the specific details have faded. And defense attorneys will absolutely hammer on this during trial. They'll bring witnesses who say they don't remember. They'll point out all the potential exculpatory evidence that could have existed but is now lost to time. They'll argue that it's fundamentally unfair to put Jacques on trial when he can't possibly reconstruct his whereabouts and activities from a specific day 36 years ago. But the DNA doesn't have memory problems. The DNA doesn't get confused or forgetful. The DNA is an objective record that places Jacques' blood on the murder weapon, and that's going to be the prosecution's trump card every time the defense tries to muddy the waters with arguments about faded memories and lost evidence. They'll keep coming back to that central fact. Your client's blood was on the ligatures used to strangle Mary Ann Daniels. Explain that. Give us an innocent explanation for that. And if you can't, then everything else is just noise. The covert DNA collection from the beer bottle is also going to be a major point of contention. Defense attorneys will argue that there's something fundamentally wrong with police secretly surveilling someone and collecting their discarded items for DNA testing. They'll say it's an invasion of privacy, that it's sneaky and underhanded, that it violates the spirit, if not the letter, of the Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches. And they'll try to get that evidence suppressed. But courts have consistently ruled that once you discard something in a public place, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy in it. It becomes abandoned property that anyone can collect. And police are allowed to use subterfuge and surveillance techniques as long as they're not violating constitutional rights. So the beer bottle DNA is almost certainly going to be admissible. But expect the defense to make a big show of objecting to it, partly because they have to try every possible angle to exclude evidence, and partly because they want to plant seeds of doubt in the jury's mind about the methods police used. They want jurors thinking about whether this is the kind of police behavior we want to encourage, whether we want to live in a society where detectives are following people around collecting their trash and testing it for DNA. And here's where public opinion becomes really interesting, because there's a generational divide in how people view these techniques. Younger people who've grown up in the digital age with constant surveillance and data collection tend to be more accepting of genetic genealogy and covert DNA collection. They figure their data is already out there anyway. They've been giving their information to tech companies and social media platforms their whole lives. So what's one more database? What's one more way their information might be used? And if it helps catch murderers, then that seems like a worthwhile trade-off. But older people, particularly people in the demographic that this video is targeting, 30 plus approaching retirement or already retired, they tend to be more concerned about privacy, more skeptical of government power, more worried about the slippery slope of surveillance technology. They remember a time when you could live your life without leaving a digital footprint everywhere you went. And they're uncomfortable with the idea that your genetic information, which is literally the most personal data possible, can be used to identify you and your entire extended family without your knowledge or consent. This generational tension is playing out in legislative debates across the country. Some states have passed laws regulating how genetic genealogy can be used by law enforcement, requiring warrants or limiting it to violent felonies or mandating certain privacy protections, while other states have taken a hands-off approach and let law enforcement use the technology however they see fit. And there's no federal standard, so we have this patchwork of different rules in different jurisdictions. And criminals are presumably learning to factor this into their planning. If you're going to commit a crime, maybe do it in a state that has strict regulations on genetic genealogy, rather than one that gives police free rein. Though again, most violent criminals aren't thinking strategically like this. They're acting impulsively or compulsively. But the point is, we're in uncharted territory legally and ethically. We're figuring out in real time what the rules should be for this powerful technology that didn't exist a decade ago. Mary Ann Daniels' case is also significant because it highlights the specific vulnerability of people with developmental disabilities in our society. Mary Ann needed support and supervision. That's why she was in transitional housing. That's why she had a caseworker. But the level of support she received was clearly inadequate. She was placed in housing that wasn't properly vetted. She was living next door to someone who turned out to be dangerous. And there was apparently no ongoing monitoring to ensure she was safe. No regular check-ins from her caseworker, no safety protocols for residents in that building. And when she was murdered, it took 4 days for anyone to notice because nobody was paying attention. The property manager only found her because he came to collect rent, not because anyone had reported her missing or expressed concern that they hadn't seen her. And that's a systemic failure that goes way beyond just the individual tragedy of Mary Ann's death. We have an obligation as a society to protect our most vulnerable members. People with disabilities, children, elderly people, anyone who can't fully protect themselves. And when we fail in that obligation, when we put vulnerable people in situations where they're exposed to danger without adequate safeguards, we're complicit in what happens to them. And Mary Ann's sister Sandy was absolutely right to call out the social worker who placed her in that housing, because that placement decision had deadly consequences. Now, obviously, the social worker didn't intend for Mary Ann to be murdered. They were probably doing their best with limited resources and too many clients, and not enough time to thoroughly investigate every housing situation. But intent doesn't matter when the result is a dead woman. And there needs to be accountability, not just for the person who allegedly committed the murder, but for the system that failed to protect the victim. This is part of a broader pattern where vulnerable people become victims of violence at disproportionate rates. Sex workers are targeted by serial killers because they're less likely to be immediately missed, and their cases get less investigative attention. Homeless people are victimized because they're isolated and marginalized. People with mental illness or developmental disabilities are exploited because they're trusting and have difficulty assessing danger. And immigrants and undocumented people are targeted because they're afraid to report crimes to police. And all of these factors contribute to a system where certain lives are implicitly valued less than others, where some victims get extensive resources devoted to their cases while others get the bare minimum. And genetic genealogy is actually helping to address this inequity to some degree because it doesn't care about the victim's social status. DNA evidence is DNA evidence regardless of whether the victim was a college student or a sex worker or a disabled woman in transitional housing. The science works the same way and leads to the same results. So we're seeing cold cases solved across the spectrum of victim demographics. And that's progress, even if it doesn't erase the initial inequity of how those cases were handled. Let's also examine what was happening in Joseph Jacques's life after he allegedly murdered Mary Ann, because this gets at the psychological question of how someone lives with themselves after committing such a brutal crime. According to court records, he had minimal contact with the criminal justice system after Mary Ann's death. Just that one reckless driving conviction in 1992, which suggests he wasn't someone who was constantly getting in trouble. He wasn't a career criminal with a long rap sheet. He was someone who allegedly committed one terrible crime and then went back to living a normal life. And that's actually more disturbing in some ways than a serial offender because it suggests either tremendous self-control or tremendous compartmentalization. He had the capacity to do something horrific and then just carry on as if nothing happened, going to work, interacting with people, maybe forming relationships, all while knowing what he'd done. And the big question that will probably never be answered is whether Mary Ann was his only victim or whether there were others we don't know about. The FBI's statistics on serial killers suggest that many of them have a cooling-off period between murders, and some stop killing altogether for various reasons. They move to a different location where they don't have the same opportunities. They enter a relationship that satisfies whatever psychological need was driving the violence. They have a close call with law enforcement that scares them into stopping. They simply age out of the behaviors as their testosterone levels drop and their physical capabilities decline. So it's entirely possible that Jacques allegedly killed Mary Ann and then never killed again. But it's also possible that there are other unsolved murders out there that might now be re-examined in light of his arrest. Detectives are almost certainly looking at cold cases in Mount Vernon, where he lived after leaving Everett, and in Las Vegas, where he's been living more recently, trying to see if there are any unsolved murders with similar characteristics. Vulnerable women killed in their homes, strangulation, any cases that might potentially connect to Jacques through DNA or circumstantial evidence. This is standard investigative procedure whenever someone is arrested for a cold case murder. You look at their entire geographic and temporal footprint to see if they might be connected to other crimes, and sometimes you get hits. Sometimes you find that the person you arrested for one murder is actually responsible for multiple homicides across different jurisdictions. And that's another way that solving cold cases has a multiplier effect. You arrest someone for one crime, and suddenly you're clearing multiple cases and giving closure to multiple families. But sometimes the person really was a one-time offender. Someone who committed a single terrible act and then stopped for whatever reason. And we may never know which category Jacques falls into, whether Mary Ann was his only victim or the tip of the iceberg. The psychological profile of someone who could allegedly commit this crime is worth examining in detail because it tells us something about the nature of violence against vulnerable people. The fact that Mary Ann was strangled with multiple ligatures suggests a level of deliberation and control that's inconsistent with a sudden outburst of rage. This wasn't someone who got into an argument and threw a punch that accidentally killed someone. This was someone who made a calculated decision to end another person's life and took the time to fashion an effective murder weapon from items that were available. The bra could have been Mary Ann's own clothing. The purse strap could have been from her purse. The electrical cord could have been from an appliance in her apartment, which suggests the killer was improvising with what was at hand, but doing so deliberately and methodically. And the fact that 3 separate ligatures were used suggests either that the first one wasn't working effectively enough, or that the killer wanted to make absolutely certain the victim was dead. Strangulation is also significant from a psychological standpoint because it's an intimate form of killing. You have to be physically close to your victim. You have to maintain that closeness for several minutes while they struggle and die. It's not like shooting someone from a distance where you can dissociate from the act. Strangulation requires you to be engaged with the violence in a very direct way. And research suggests that people who strangle their victims often have specific psychological issues related to control and power. They want to watch the life drain out of someone. They want to feel that power over life and death. And there's often a sexual component to strangulation murders, even when there's no sexual assault. The act of controlling someone's breath and feeling them weaken under your hands triggers some kind of gratification for these killers. So Detective Logothetti and prosecutors are probably looking at this as potentially being a sexually motivated crime, even if there's no evidence of sexual assault. The strangulation itself may have been the gratification, and if that's the case, it raises disturbing questions about whether Jacques had been fantasizing about killing women before Mary Ann, whether he had a history of violence or aggression that never resulted in criminal charges, whether there were warning signs that people missed or dismissed. And this is where the challenge comes in, because 36 years later, it's almost impossible to reconstruct someone's psychological state and behavioral history from that time period. The people who knew him then might be dead, or might not remember, or might not have seen anything concerning. And Jacques isn't going to voluntarily cooperate with a psychological evaluation that could be used against him at trial. So we're left with speculation and inference based on the crime itself, and whatever limited information is available about his life before and after the murder. What we do know is that he was 25 years old when Mary Ann was killed, which puts him right in the demographic sweet spot for violent crime. Men aged 18 to 35 commit the vast majority of violent crimes. Testosterone is high, impulse control is still developing. The prefrontal cortex that governs decision-making and consequences isn't fully mature until around age 25. So you've got this perfect storm of physical capability, hormonal drive, and incomplete judgment that makes young men particularly prone to violence. And then most men age out of this as they get older. They develop better impulse control. Their testosterone drops. They have more to lose in terms of jobs and families and reputations. And their rates of violent crime decline sharply after age 35. So if Jacques did kill Mary Ann when he was 25 and then never killed again, that would actually fit a pretty common pattern. Young men committing violent crimes and then stopping as they mature. But again, we don't know for certain that he stopped. We just know he wasn't caught for anything else, and those are two very different things. The criminal justice system only knows about crimes that get reported and investigated and solved. There's a huge dark figure of unreported and unsolved crime out there, and it's entirely possible that someone could commit multiple murders and only get caught for one of them, especially if they were targeting vulnerable victims whose deaths might not get thorough investigations. The other dimension of this case that deserves attention is the impact on the broader Everett community. Because when a murder goes unsolved for 36 years, it creates a lingering sense of unease. People know there's a killer out there somewhere. They wonder if it could be someone they know, someone they pass on the street, someone who shops at the same grocery store or goes to the same church. And that uncertainty is corrosive to community trust and cohesion. It makes people suspicious of their neighbors. It makes them feel unsafe in their own community. And that psychological damage persists until the case is solved. So when Detective Logothetti announced the arrest of Joseph Jacques in January 2025, it wasn't just Mary Ann's family that felt relief. It was potentially the entire community getting a sense of closure and resolution. The monster has been identified. He's been arrested. He's going to face justice. And we can stop wondering and worrying about who did this. This is part of why cold case work is so important beyond just the individual cases. It's about restoring community trust, demonstrating that law enforcement is competent and dedicated, showing that cases don't just get forgotten, and proving that justice eventually prevails, even if it takes decades. And every solved cold case reinforces those messages and makes communities feel safer and more confident in their police departments, which in turn makes people more willing to cooperate with investigations, more likely to come forward as witnesses, more trusting of the criminal justice system generally. So there's a positive feedback loop where solving cold cases leads to better community relations, which leads to more cases getting solved, which reinforces community trust. And we're seeing this play out in Everett and other jurisdictions that have made cold case work a priority. The technical aspects of how genetic genealogy actually works are worth explaining in more detail because this is cutting-edge science that most people don't fully understand. When DNA is collected from a crime scene, it contains millions of genetic markers, and the traditional approach was to look at specific markers called short tandem repeats, or STRs, that vary between individuals. And you'd compare the STR profile from the crime scene to profiles in CODIS, hoping for a match. But this only works if the person is already in the database. And CODIS only contains DNA from convicted offenders and crime scenes and missing persons. It doesn't include the general population. So if your killer has never been arrested, you're not going to find them in CODIS, no matter how good your DNA profile is. Genetic genealogy takes a completely different approach. Instead of just looking at a handful of markers, it sequences large portions of the genome, getting information from hundreds of thousands of genetic variants called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And this creates a much more detailed genetic profile that can be compared to profiles in public genealogy databases where ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded their DNA, hoping to learn about their ancestry or find biological relatives. And when you compare the crime scene profile to millions of profiles in these databases, you're going to get partial matches, people who share segments of DNA with the unknown person, and those shared segments indicate a family relationship. The more DNA you share, the closer the relationship, and by looking at multiple partial matches and how they relate to each other, you can start building a family tree. This is where the forensic genetic genealogist comes in. Someone like Deb Stone, who worked on the Mary Ann Daniels case. These are people who have expertise in both genetics and genealogy. They understand how DNA is inherited, and they know how to use genealogical records and techniques to trace family relationships. So they take those partial matches from the database, and they start researching each one, looking at census records and birth certificates and marriage licenses and obituaries and all the documentary evidence of how families connect to each other across generations. And they work backward through time, identifying common ancestors. If 3 people in the database all share DNA segments with the crime scene profile and with each other, then they likely descend from a common ancestor. And once you identify that common ancestor, you can work forward through all their descendants, trying to figure out which branch of the family tree includes the person who left DNA at the crime scene. This process can take weeks or months, depending on how much information is available and how cooperative the family members are and how many branches need to be investigated. And eventually, you narrow it down to a manageable pool of candidates who are the right age and lived in the right area at the time of the crime. And then, law enforcement takes over and investigates each candidate to see if there's additional evidence connecting them to the crime. And that's when you get situations like Detective Logathetti realizing that one of the genetic genealogy candidates was actually interviewed by police in 1989 as Mary Ann's neighbor. And suddenly all the pieces fall into place and you know you've found your killer. And then you have to confirm it with a direct DNA sample, which is where the covert collection comes in. Getting that beer bottle or coffee cup or cigarette butt that the suspect has discarded. And once the lab confirms the match, you've got your case. The entire process is remarkable when you think about it. You're taking DNA from a crime scene 36 years ago and using modern technology to read that DNA in ways that weren't possible in 1989. And then you're connecting that DNA to family trees built from genealogical records and consumer DNA databases. And the result is you identify someone who thought they'd gotten away with murder. Someone who had no idea that their distant cousins uploading DNA to ancestry websites would eventually lead to their arrest. And this is happening over and over again across the country. Hundreds of cold cases being solved, thousands more in the pipeline being worked on right now. Families getting closure, communities getting safer, criminals getting caught. The future implications are staggering. Within the next decade or two, we'll probably reach a tipping point where so many people have their DNA in genealogical databases that virtually anyone can be identified through family connections. You won't need the actual perpetrator's DNA to be in the database. You just need third or fourth cousins. And we're rapidly approaching universal coverage, where everyone has enough relatives in the databases to be identifiable. And at that point, genetic genealogy becomes essentially a universal surveillance system for anyone who leaves biological evidence at a crime scene. You commit a crime in 2025 and leave DNA behind. You're going to be identified. It's just a matter of how long the process takes. Whether it's days or weeks or months, but you will be caught. And this should fundamentally change criminal behavior. Rational people should be deterred from committing violent crimes because the risk of being caught is approaching 100%. But again, most violent criminals aren't rational actors, so the deterrent effect is limited. What genetic genealogy really does is ensure accountability. It ensures that people who do terrible things will eventually face consequences, even if they avoid immediate detection. And that's a form of justice that was never possible before in human history. For the first time ever, we have a technology that makes it genuinely impossible to commit a violent crime and escape justice forever. And that's a profound shift in the power dynamic between criminals and society. And we're still figuring out what it means and how to handle it responsibly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.